Hello, and welcome to the final installment of this year's series of lectures as part of What Economists Really Do. My name's Abby Adams. I'm a professor in the economics department at Oxford and in charge of external engagement more broadly. Today, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Dennis Egger, who is an associate professor in the department. Dennis is a development economist who uses a creative mix of experiments and big data sets to research migration and networks in a variety of different contexts, including work in Kenya and Ethiopia, in China, and also in Switzerland. He also, I'm going to give you a bit of a plug, Dennis, he recently won the very prestigious Frisch Prize for his amazing work on the impacts of cash transfer programs. So today, Dennis is going to be giving us an overview of the economic literature on migration as it relates to refugees. Dennis will be speaking for about 35 to 40 minutes, throughout which if you can just put your questions in the Q&A, I'll collect them. So then we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of Q&A before wrapping up. But with that, over to you, Dennis, and thanks again for doing this.
Thanks very much, Abby, for the introduction, and welcome everybody. So let's start with some facts. So migration has increased rapidly since the 1970s, more than doubling over this time, and sort of has reached levels that we've seen before, but not for a long time. It's sort of back to where it was just before World War I. This is a similar pattern that we also see in trade, which was very globalized at the time. Now, even though sort of this is an age of migration and people living outside their country of origins, the share of those has increased rapidly, it is still relatively small. So globally, even now, 96.4% of people still live in the country of birth. And so just to sort of, even though this is a very sort of important political topic worldwide, it's still a relatively small phenomenon. You see here on the right that most of this migration is going towards high-income countries, such as the OECD countries, and including the UK here in those. And you see here that sort of the share of migrants as a share of the total population in these high-income countries has sort of doubled almost from 7 to about 14%. So it's much larger as a phenomenon in high-income countries. Now, this is not sort of predominantly because countries have sort of opened up their immigration systems, although that has happened too. But the sort of drivers underlying this are sort of more global, in the sense that there's a developing world with higher and higher incomes and more sort of open sharing of information and aspirations and educational policies that sort of allow people to access these avenues for migration. Now, I've plotted here the UK because you know, many of you will be in the UK, where you sort of see that since the 70s, the share of immigrants as a share of the total UK population has increased even more than sort of for high-income countries in general. For the sort of working age population, this is the red line here, it's gone from sort of 7-8% in the 70s to almost 20% today. Now, this is just another way, again, to show you that immigration is concentrated in high-income countries. This plots sort of the stock of the share of immigrants as a share of the population against sort of GDP per capita. The UK is somewhere up here in the high-income countries, and you sort of see that, you know, basically the lowest income countries here don't see very much in terms of immigration, whereas the highest income countries see the bulk of this. Now, let's just sort of step back for a moment and sort of think about what migration is, and sort of try to sort of capture all the different things that people have worked in this space. So migration is sort of a movement of people from an origin to a destination, and there's a bunch of questions that you could ask around that. So the first, of course, is like, who migrates, right? This is what we call selection in economics, sort of who decides to go. And typically we'll model this as economists do, as sort of some decision that involves both benefits of migration and the costs of doing so. And there's, of course, a bunch of different types of migration here to think about. So is this within borders versus across international borders? And sort of the vast majority of migration, of course, is within borders. As I've showed you, the international migration part is still relatively small. There's also this question of temporary versus permanent. Are people migrating temporarily to, make use of seasonal opportunities or of educational opportunities and then going back? Or is this something that they think about doing permanently? And this is something that we will get to when we talk about refugees at the end, there's also this big question around, is this voluntary versus forced? Is there different types of selection or decisions going on when, for example, migration is driven by climate change or war or other things much less in the control of individuals? And then how is the sort of legal environment set up to deal with these different types of migration? Now, economists have worked on all kinds of questions surrounding selection. So just to sort of put here a few pictograms of types of reasons that people may have for migrating, which is obviously to take advantage of economic or financial opportunities, to get education, to get networks and sort of cultural exposure, for relationships, or also, to avoid prosecution, for example, as we'll see with refugees in the end. Now, economists have studied a wide range of potential effects of migration at the destination. And the one that sort of maybe comes to mind, at least to many of you, would be on local labor markets. So you have an inflow of immigrants into a labor market. How does that shape local wages? Does this displace local workers? And so on. But that, of course, isn't everything, right? Migrants also are not just workers. They're also people who demand goods and services. And this is going to be sort of a key point that I'd like to make here, is that, often immigrants in the media are sort of portrayed as workers who take jobs or sort of compete with local workers, but they're also demanding goods. They're also growing demand in the economy. And it's not the case that sort of larger countries have, fewer jobs, quite the contrary. So we'll have to sort of think about all the aspects of immigrants' integration or role that they play in society. There's a vast literature on how immigrants may boost innovation. They make up a disproportionate share of innovators, of people founding companies. How immigrants give access to trade and new networks and potential destination markets for local firms. How they sort of change and shape the local distribution of skills and education. Of course, similarly in the realm of sort of culture, social norms, and political institutions and sort of voting behavior. I like this sort of quote from the Swiss author Max Frisch, who sort of said that we wanted workers, but we got people instead. And so sort of increasingly, particularly in the last sort of decades, economics has thought of all these different aspects of immigrants and the roles they play in society, much beyond the idea of them just being workers that come in to sort of contribute in that way. Now, there's, of course, the reverse of all of this. And sort of, economists have also studied how that now impacts people, or where people, places where people emigrate from. Immigrants may send back remittances, money. They may, again, sort of provide access to trade and networks. They may go back and start farms. They may sort of transmit information of potential opportunities at the destination, and therefore changing sort of people in their home countries' aspirations or investments into education and potential future migration. There's sort of a debate here that unfortunately we won't get to touch on very much, but we will, of sort of brain drain versus brain gain. Is immigration something that benefits countries where lots of people are leaving, or is this something that hurts them? Because, as we'll see, typically it's the most educated people that tend to leave. So, like I said, we can't really touch on all of these, but I just sort of wanted to put this out there just to sort of give you a sense of all the different aspects that people have worked on and the sort of vast literature that's underpinning all of these questions. So what are we going to do today then? So we're going to talk first a little bit about this middle part of selection, sort of who migrates and sort of resulting from this, we'll sort of discuss why that leads to a challenge for estimating the impacts of migration, both on migrants themselves, but also at the destination or at the origin. Because when people are selected, that is when, the people who tend to migrate are different from the ones that either are already there or that stay, that's going to tend to confound our empirical estimates of these impacts. And I'm going to discuss a few things of how to address that. Then we're going to sort of talk a little bit about the impacts of migration at the destination on labor markets, but also local firms and workers. This is because as we are in the UK, this being one of the predominant immigration countries, I hope this is of particular interest. And then we'll sort of touch at the very end a little bit on the role that refugees play and how they might be potentially different from other types of migrants. All right. So as long as we're sort of in the realm of voluntary or at least partially voluntary migration, migrants choose whether to migrate. And economists invariably have a pretty simple model of this, where you to migrate if the benefit weigh the costs. That we call revealed preference. So by migrating, refugees have revealed a preference to migrate, and therefore that they prefer this option over all other options. Now, of course, they may migrate for different reasons. There's sort of what we call pull factors, such as demand for labor, higher wages, economic growth destination, schooling and technology, all kinds of different potential things that could pull migrants to a destination, but also push factors, such as, things that typically might not be as good in the origin. One thing I want to mention here is that it's really important to think of migration not just as a sort of one-time thing, but as a sort of idea of an investment intertemporally. Many people migrate, and this has been shown in a lot of papers, to invest into their future or their kids' futures. And even if temporarily they might sort of take a cut or find it really hard to integrate, they sort of at least anticipate in the longer term that this may be beneficial for them and their children and so on. All right, so let's sort of think about this in terms of a sort of graphic model. So what I'm plotting here is sort of different people. Each dot is a different person. And let's, for a moment, and this is definitely not what we do in economics always, just assume that all they care about is the wage. And on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is the wage at the origin, and at the vertical axis is the wage at the destination. So people to the right on this graph here have sort of relatively high wages at the origin. People at the top of the graph have relatively high wages at the destination. Now, if there weren't any costs to migrating, if you could migrate freely, you would migrate if the wage at the destination is higher than at the origin. So if you're above the 45-degree line, which means, you sort of at the destination, you'd get paid more than at the origin. Now, in reality, migration is costly. And this cost may have many different components. It may be the airfare, but also the adjustment costs, the feeling of loneliness or disconnection that you might feel, the sort of getting visa requirements, and so on and so on and so on. There's many different costs. And what I denote them here is with this sort of Greek letter tau. And what this means is that there's the only people who sort of, for which the benefits are not just the wage at the destination is not just bigger than at the origin, but also bigger than bigger enough or bigger by enough of a margin to cover these additional costs will actually migrate. And so in a sort of economic model, these types of costs are in a sense inefficient. There are people, such as the ones that I've plotted here in orange, who would benefit from migrating to a destination, but who cannot go there because they're prevented through some of these costs. And if these costs could be reduced relatively cheaply, then that would sort of unlock additional benefits for future potential migrants and lead to a more what we would call sort of optimal allocation. Now, not all costs can be reduced very easily, right? Potentially, road building is very expensive. Flights, are very hard to reduce the prices for. But others, such as legal restrictions, may be removed quite easily. One point here that I sort of want to make and that comes out of this model is that when you start to lower these migration costs even further from what they are now, the potential benefits of future migrants from doing that are likely going to be smaller than the benefits the previous migrants have already experienced. Because already at the costs as they are now, the people who benefited the most, those who before were blue up here, they have already migrated despite the very high costs. And so the idea is that, maybe potential future gains might be a little bit smaller from reducing these costs. Now, maybe the picture in reality doesn't quite look like this. Maybe people's wages at the origin and at the destination are sort of correlated. So here I've sort of drawn a picture where people who earn relatively a lot at the origin are also those who earn a lot at the destination. And this is maybe because, for example, high educated people earn more wherever they are, right? And so if you now just compare wages of people who migrated to wages who did not migrate, right? What you're going to find is that the wages of those who migrated are very, very high, and the wages of those who did not migrate are very low. Now, of course, you never observe both these wages. Either you stayed and then you observe the wage at the origin, this is the gray dots, or you migrated and then you observe the wage at the destination. And what we sort of call this problem is a problem of selection bias. So now you're going to see that migrants have much higher wages than people who stayed behind. And you want to conclude that, well, therefore, migration must be very effective and must have very high returns. But maybe you're confounding this wage differential with the fact that, those people who migrated would have had higher wages even in the origin anyway, because they were what we call positively selected. And so when people choose whether to migrate or not, you can't just sort of, look at observationally migrants versus non-migrants, compare them, and sort of say that, maybe, that's reflective of the true causal effect of migration. And we're going to see this sort of issue of selection everywhere, not just when we try to estimate the impacts of migration on migrants themselves, but, migrants may tend to go to particular places, for example, places that offer the best opportunities for them. And these places may have been different anyway, whether they had migration or not. And if you just go and compare places with lots of migrants to places without migrants, you're going to sort of confound the true effect of immigration from these sort of underlying differences that would have been there anyway. This is the same when you look across firms that have a lot of migrants to firms that don't. You can't just compare them because you sort of don't know what the counterfactual would have been. And this is sort of driven by migrants selecting into particular labor markets, firms, destinations, and so on. Now, of course, this could be the other way around. It could be that those who have the lowest wage at the origin are the ones that benefit the most from migration, presumably or potentially because the skills are sort of inversely correlated. Maybe, whatever the economies at the origin is not very well suited to these types of people, but the origin at the economy at the destinations may be different and better suited to them. And in that case, you would get negative selection. Now, how does the empirical evidence look like? Does it look like migrants who move across international borders are positively or negatively selected? So would they have had higher wages even in the origin or not? And the evidence here is pretty clear in favor of positive selection. So what this graph here shows is that the probability on the horizontal axis of people migrating when the maximum or the highest level of education is primary school versus the probability of migrating on the horizontal on the vertical axis for people who are tertiary educated or have some sort of college degree. And across virtually all countries, you see the probability of migration is much, much higher for high educated people. Another way to show this, and this is here for the UK, is that basically the share of people with a college degree among immigrants is much, much, much higher than even the share of people with a college degree in the native-born population in a very high-income country. So even in high-income countries like the UK, immigrants are more positively selected than locals, on average, much higher education levels. Another way to look at this is not just in terms of education, but in terms of sort of household income. So what you see here in orange is the distribution of household income in low and middle income countries. And then in blue is the probability that in a randomly selected sample of people, they would say that they're actively preparing to migrate to another country. And you see that the concentration of the vast amount of migrants, or at least people thinking about migration, are concentrated in this sort of very right tail in the upper level of the household income distribution. Now, just to touch briefly, in some of the poorest countries, this selection is very, very severe. So you see, for example, in the red box here, some of the very poorest countries in the world, according to GDP per capita, and very, very high shares of the high educated people in these countries leave the country at some point during their life. And this has sort of led to worries about potential brain drain. So, if all the most educated people leave, who's left behind, and what's the country to do with that? Now, this sort of pattern doesn't sort of persist throughout the income distribution of countries. In fact, what you see is a sort of inverse U-shaped, a sort of hump-shaped distribution, where in the very poorest countries here on the left, very few people emigrate. Then in the sort of middle income countries across all the different decades, people start to emigrate more. And then in the highest income countries, people again tend to stay. And there's various reasons for why this might be the case. Many of them have to do with, the lowest income countries just not having the resources to even pay the cost or the access in terms of visa and other types of restrictions to leave. Whereas the highest income countries, they're pretty happy where they are already. But then in the middle, that's sort of where a lot of the migration action takes place. All right. So now, given that we know that migrants are selected, it's sort of tricky to sort of say, how do we get back from just, looking at observed wages or incomes from migrants and non-migrants? How do we get back the impact that this migration had on them? And clearly, we cannot just compare those who migrate to those who didn't, because they are very, very different to start with. And what people have done here is be very clever. They sort of used visa lotteries and compare people who by chance won a lottery to people who, ex ante looked relatively similar but didn't win. And then they sort of compare what happens throughout the future of their life and follow up with both the winners and the losers. And that's in itself is a difficult task data-wise. And then they sort of see what happens. And what you see across many, many different places, there's a US H-1B lottery, there's a visa lottery for Bangladeshis to go to Malaysia in this Mubarak paper, or sort of a guest worker program of Indian workers going to the UAE. Across these settings, you see very, very large returns to randomly being selected for migration, ranging from sort of 100% to 600%, and even more in some papers, increases in incomes. So it seems like migration has massive benefits to potential migrants, and this work by Clemens, for example, calls the migration restrictions are therefore the sort of trillion-dollar bills on the sidewalk, the most effective potential development intervention that we could think of. If we could just move more people, we could massively benefit a lot of people moving to higher income countries. There's of course a flip side. Wages aren't everything. People have looked at other types of outcomes, and in particular, there's sort of this concern that yes, maybe you earn a higher wage, but you lose access to your networks, and maybe you feel lonely or sort of alienated from your culture. And in particular, there's sort of two papers I know. One is again for these Indian workers who go to the UAE as guest workers. And they do actually report lower subjective well-being. Tongans moving to the US report higher stress, though they do increase higher subjective well-being. So there may be a sort of non-monetary cost to migration that we might be underestimating if we just look at wages. One thing that's sort of been documented throughout, and this is here data for the UK on the right, is that when immigrants move, there is a substantial level of skill downgrading. So this is the sort of story of the engineer who ends up driving Uber. What this shows is the sort of, in blue, the predicted distribution of wages that immigrants should have in the UK if you looked at, their education levels, their age and experience level, versus the sort of actual distribution. And what you see here is that in the actual distribution, immigrants conditional on their education and experience levels are much, much more overrepresented in the lower part of the income distribution. And this is true not just for the UK, it's sort of all over. When people migrate, they sort of have to accept or have to sort of face this downgrade of their skills and education and so on in the destination labor. So looks like, at least by revealed preferences or some of these lottery measures, that there's potentially large gains to migrations for migrants. But how does that now impact labor markets at the destination and sort of local firms and employees? So the first sort of thing maybe that comes to mind, and this is often how sort of political debates or sort of articles are phrased, is that, well, immigrants increase local labor supply, they flood the local labor market with additional supply of workers, and that should lead to a decrease in local wages because, labor demand is downward sloping, and this is sort of the classical economic story. But this, again, is really not necessarily true because migrants also are consumers, they're taxpayers, they're innovators. And so they sort of lead to not just a sort of localized impact on the local labor market, but a sort of what we call a general equilibrium impact on the economy as a whole. And basically, the way we sort of tend to model this is the impact of immigrants on local workers and local wages depends to a large degree on whether immigrants are substitutes for local workers. That is, can they do the same types of jobs and enter the same types of work as natives, or are they what we would call complements, such that an additional immigrant actually increases the productivity of local workers and therefore sort of increases their wages. Now, how do you sorry, just before we get there, one additional point here is that, for example, what's been documented is this sort of the converse of the skill downgrading of immigrants. As they come, they sort of enter positions much below their sort of levels of education. There is conversely the skill upgrading of natives, that when immigrants enter a local firm or labor market, you see that natives already working in this firm or in this labor market tend to sort of work above their sort of expected positions conditional on their education. That might benefit them in turn. Now, this is sort of, this sort of general equilibrium in the labor market, but there's sort of even broader general equilibrium effects. Migrants may increase overall productivity through different types of effects. So just as I've argued before, migrants are in almost every country disproportionately represented among innovators, among entrepreneurs, and there's been a bunch of work showing that an increase in immigration tends to increase local patenting and innovation. There's also evidence that immigrants open up new trade routes and access to investment, often from their places of origin. And people have been very, very creative here at using migrants' existing networks and connections to places of their origin to sort of document very clearly that the driving force of this increased trade and innovation is coming through the immigration channel. And then lastly, certainly for the UK and the US and many other countries, there's similar studies. Immigrants are net contributors to the government budget. So they pay in more in terms of taxes than they get out in terms of social security and support. And if we think government spending is productive and increases the sort of output of an economy, then again, immigration is one part in which this can help. And this is certainly something that's on everybody's mind as the sort of demographic transition in Europe is happening, and with an aging population and a low sort of birth rate, maybe immigration is one way to sort of deal with the big fiscal burden of that. Now let's turn to sort of empirical evidence a little bit. So this is one of the big debates in economics, and I put it here as a Card versus Borjas. These are just two big figures, but there's a bunch of people playing a part in this debate. And the debate is, is it really true that when immigrants flow into local labor market, that there is a decrease in wages for natives from their jobs? And of course, the big question or the big problem in this debate, and this is why it's a debate, is that it's not an easy question to answer. Places where immigrants go tend to be very differently selected from places where they don't go. And so you can't just compare places with a lot of immigrants to places without a lot of immigrants, because they might tend to be more urban, better suited for immigrants, and so on and so on. And so is the difference that you observe really because of immigration or because of all these underlying differences? And so the way to sort of get around this is to use what we would call exogenous or sort of unanticipated, unexpected shocks, often through sort of refugee waves or unanticipated policy changes. So I'm going to give you three examples of how people have used to have done that. The one famous example is the one from David Card, who recently won the Nobel Prize for this work and others, using the Mariel boat lift in Miami, where over the span of 6 months, because of a sort of economic crisis in Cuba and an opening of borders in the US, sort of 125,000 Cubans reached the city of Miami within 6 months, which represented a big local increase, 7% increase in the local labor force. And Kurtz have documented actually no effect at all on local employment or local wages. And so the conclusion was actually, the impact of immigrants on local wages is very small, and there isn't really any evidence for displacement. There's two other papers that sort of use border policy changes in Europe to sort of try to get at that. And the idea is, countries open their borders because of some cross-border treaty, which allows now immigrants access to labor markets around the border, which should then be more affected than places further away from the border. And I'm just putting here two examples with sort of slightly different results. There's the Dussmann et al. Paper finding that people immigrating from the Czech Republic into Germany do lead to a very small decline in wages and some reduction in local employment, particularly of older natives. Whereas in Switzerland, they find the opposite, is that Germans moving into the Swiss labor market increase the local productivity of firms, increase the number of firms, increase local employment and local wages. The idea here is that there's sort of an underlying skills shortage, and that immigration is allowing local firms to fill these skills shortage, the shortage of skills, and therefore increase their productivity. This is sort of like the way the literature has moved, is sort of because these labor markets are so different, and that and selection is such a big issue. People have sort of tended to zoom in on local firms and sort of see what happens to within the particular firm once they start getting access to more migrants. And one really, really neat idea here, again, to overcome selection, is to use visa lotteries in the US. The idea here is that lots of different firms apply for a worker visa, but only some of them then get their visas granted at random. And so now you can compare two firms in the same labor market. One just got access to one more immigrant worker, the other don't. And the results here are pretty unequivocally positive. Local firms benefit from having these additional workers. There's no crowding out of native workers. And in fact, in many places, you see positive increase in wages for local workers, suggesting that at least within the firm, there is this complementarity, that additional migrants actually make the existing workers more productive. I have some similar work on this in Switzerland. I find exactly the same thing. Here I use sort of the random placement of asylum seekers into different labor markets in Switzerland, and sort of see whether firms who by chance get one more sort of immigrant of the origin that they already have local workers from, so firms hiring lots of Eritreans versus firms hiring lots of Syrians, by chance one firm gets more Syrians into its local labor market. Again, I show that benefits the firm and doesn't crowd out any sort of local employment. In fact, at least increases in local wages. So what's the sort of my take, or the net take that I have on this literature, is that immigration seems to benefit local firms through sort of primarily this complementarity channel. You can hire highly skilled, often in a situation of skill shortage, skilled immigrants at lower cost, addressing skill shortages, increasing access to trade, and increasing productivity of local workers. There's very limited evidence. The very few studies that do show negative impacts show that these are very small on local workers and their wages. All right. So in the last sort of 5 minutes, I'm now sort of gonna switch a little bit and sort of just touch on refugees and the sort of role they play in this entire literature. So just like migration overall, refugee migration has increased massively. There's over 100 million forcibly displaced people in 2022. Now, importantly, very, very, very few of them end up as refugees in high-income countries, such as what you might see written about in UK newspapers. So the vast majority of these are internally displaced; they stay in their country of origin, and most of them stay in neighboring countries. So if you sort of look at the refugee flow between different regions, very, very few refugees come from regions other than Europe to Europe. And in fact, 80% of refugees are hosted in other developing countries. And this is some of the work that I work on, and that unfortunately there isn't enough work on. But what we're sort of going to focus on here, because we're in the UK, is the very, very small share of these people who come to Europe or to the UK or to high income countries and ask for official asylum in these countries. Now, of course, these people, or refugees, people who come as refugees, are different from other migrants in many ways. So they're differently selected. People who are forcibly displaced may not be the ones who have chosen to migrate to make the most of these opportunities. The displacement experience itself is different and may often be traumatic, and that may sort of impact people going through it in the longer term. There's also no sort of planning horizon often. Often these events happen unexpectedly, and there's large waves of immigration without much preparation. A lot of assets have to be left behind. Again, that obviously changes the type of experience that you have at the destination. And importantly, and we'll talk about this very, very briefly at the end, is that refugees have a very different legal status from other immigrants. Often there's restrictions for them on where they can be. There's restrictions on where they can work, whether they can work, what kind of access to government programs they have. And that, as we'll see, has a lot of impact on how they're able to make use of the destination labor market opportunities. All of this together, you see that refugees have a much harder time integrating in the destination labor market. This is data from across Europe, and you sort of see the gap in employment probability between immigrants overall and natives, which is very small. Immigrants overall tend to look quite similar in terms of employment to natives. Refugees look very different, at least initially. Very few of them are employed, and it takes a long time here, 10 to 20 years for them to look like other immigrants. But the sort of upside of that picture also is that in the long run, they do actually look quite similar and they do assimilate. It just takes them a longer time. And the question is, and the interesting thing is that you see this in Europe, but you don't see this in the US. So in the US, refugees and other immigrants have the same sort of integration trajectory in terms of employment, at least, as other migrants. And so the question is, what are the underlying drivers of this? What does this have to do with the different approaches and different policy takes that the US and Europe may be taking, and what can we learn from sort of economics research about this? So I'm just going to give you here a list of papers that have tried to look at this in various European countries. This is a little bit unsatisfactory, of course, because I cannot talk about all papers, but I just want to sort of give you a range and a bit of a flavor of what people have worked on here. So the first set of papers looks at, how is the asylum process governed and how that impacts long-term integration. And so in many countries, including the UK, refugees are sort of randomly or dispersed across the country to avoid a sort of local agglomeration or a concentration of refugees. And what all of these papers basically have found that this is detrimental to refugees, because they're often sent to labor markets with low opportunities, to places where, you know, they're the first Syrian that's ever been there, and they find it very hard to make local connections and find the social support that they need. And they sort of show that if you let refugees choose a bit more where they want to settle, that would have potentially quite large gains. There's also evidence that the quicker the asylum request is processed, the faster or the better this is for migrants. This is going to shine throughout the whole literature, is that the more clarity and the more planning horizon you can give people in terms of when they're going to get legal status, when they can work, where they can work, what's the process for naturalization, the better they do. This is the same on labor market opportunities. So often refugees are banned from working or can only work in certain sectors for 3 months or 6 months. And this paper shows that these early employment bans actually are very detrimental, not just in the short run for employment, but in the sort of long run. And this is a very, very different type of setting from the US, where in the US, basically refugees can work as early as when they arrive. There's work on employment support, in particular wage subsidies to ease the entry into the labor market have been shown to work and benefit benefit refugees. A big one is language courses. So there's these 2 papers that show language matters a lot, and that's presumably quite unsurprising. But you know, given how cheap language courses are, the benefits here are really quite large. One thing that's sort of been tried across the board is like, what happens if you just reduce benefits to refugees, and you sort of see that encourage them to take up more employment, for example, sort of to mimic a little bit the US take. And what this paper by Dussman here finds that, yes, this actually works. You know, if you reduce benefits, the refugees take up more work, but it only works in the short, up to 4 years. In the long run, actually, it increases crime and poverty and lowers the long-term integration. So this may be a little bit of a double-edged sword. And then lastly, as I was sort of already alluding to, there's these questions around sort of a long-term perspective to permanent resident citizenship. And both of these papers show that when you make the path clearer, that is, when you ease access to long-term permanent residency, migrants or refugees in particular respond by investing more into local language skills, investing more into locally suitable skills and education, and actually sort of in the longer term integrate much better. Sorry for having to give you a sort of overview without being able to go into the details, but maybe some of the questions can touch on this. And I'm going to leave you all with a list of references and papers that you can all look up and that I've mentioned here. And so with this, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and we'll take it from here.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Dennis. That was completely fascinating. And also the fact that you're able to like take the Roy model and make it sort of accessible was fantastic. So I'm going to start with the first question here from Dia, which I'm going to add something to. So they're asking about like, you know, it's a little bit more context for how economists have thought about the slow integration of refugees into European labour markets. And kind of related to that is like the figure that you showed over time, where you see that kind of refugees are sort of catching up. Is there anything there about kind of selection in out migration as well, in terms of, are they the same group of people who stay so long?
Yeah, I mean, this is great. Of course, this figure hides all kinds of differences that I've sort of tried to sort of at least allude to in the first couple of bullets. Refugees are differently selected. They come from different places with different types of education. They have these different displacement experiences. And so, you know, all of that is wrapped up in this figure. Now you're adding a sort of fifth difference, which is, you know, potentially, you know, people who stay longer are the ones who, benefited or found a footing and are therefore staying, and everybody who's not doing so well actually leaves and goes back. And this is really not something we see all that much with refugees. It's sort of, I know the data for Switzerland quite well, but this is sort of similar, I think, across European countries, that people who make it past the asylum process, that's usually a year, sometimes takes 2 years. Unfortunately, it's very slow processes sometimes, but the ones who sort of make it stay forever. So I give you an example in Switzerland. Of the people who arrive, about 40% leave within the first year because they get their refugee status not granted, they get deported, they get sent back because they don't fulfill the criteria. But of those who stay at least a year, 90%, 10 years later, live actually not just within Switzerland, but within the same location or canton within Switzerland. So sort of once they're here, once they've been accepted, they tend to stay. So my suspicion here is that not all that much here is driven by selection, and a lot of this is actually driven by people integrating, achieving the skills and the language requirements, and finding jobs slowly. And the question is really, how can we speed that up, and how can we make it so that they're able to do so quicker?
That's great, thank you. Another point that's come up in the Q&A is related to the figures that you were showing around origin and destinations for refugees, in terms of that a lot of those flows are within, if you like, kind of lower income countries, and especially to neighboring countries. I was just kind of wondering, is there any differences that you know of in terms of the impact, how do impacts differ between what we know about what happens, for example, in high income countries versus low income countries?
I mean, this is a really sort of under-researched area, the impacts of refugees in low-income countries. And this is because data is hard to come by. It's also hard to do sort of rigorous research in these settings because they're often fragile, they're unstable, they're fast-moving, and so it's under-researched. But what we do know is that the way refugees are handled is very, very different in these settings from sort of high-income countries like Europe. The predominant, so the vast majority of these live often in sort of camps that were set up to be temporary while the crisis is going on, for example. And then invariably what happens is the camps become permanent, they become like cities, because displacement situations are often protracted and take years. I'll give you some examples from Ethiopia, where I work, in different refugee camps across the country, some from conflicts in Sudan and South Sudan, some from Eritrea, a conflict that's been going on for 20, 30 years, some from Somalia. The average person in the camp has lived there for 15 to 20 years. In every camp, about half of the population is born in the camp. And even though everybody says eventually they want to go back, there isn't really a way to go back. And then about less than 0.1% of people found a way to a high-income country destination through UNHCR every year. So it's really sort of a situation where these people are in these camps, they've been there forever, there's no perspective of either going back or moving forward. And there's sort of been an approach where these camps initially set up by UN agencies and humanitarian actors that sort of go in and are able to respond quite quickly, but in the long term then get super underfunded. Food rations are being cut across the board now because all the money is going to the Middle East with the new conflict, and to Ukraine. And so there's sort of, the money starts chasing around, and these long-term protracted situations get forgotten. Yet at the same time, local countries aren't really having the incentives to integrate these people, because they also are strapped for government resources and don't really have the resources to sort of cater for this big inflow. And so what the move is currently in this literature is a little bit towards trying to get them to integrate refugees in the longer term, to integrate them into local schools and hospitals, and sort of not have just the humanitarian actors do all of that parallel system building and try to move more towards integration. But it's politically, of course, it's tricky in countries where government resources are strapped, where there's often animosities and different sort of political, religious, ethnic makeup of refugees and locals. But that's certainly where it's going, and where a lot of my work is trying to focus and try to sort of improve a little bit how we're doing this and what we can learn from that.
Well, that's devastating, some of those statistics.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for doing that work in the future. So I'm gonna, because we don't have that much time, I'm gonna ask you two questions in one, so you can sort of like decide how you want to split your time. So there are a couple of questions which have come up around the kind of statistics on skill downgrading that you kind of
Yeah.
came up with kind of more towards the beginning of
Yeah.
your talk. So both in terms of you know, your thoughts on any studies that have kind of thought about different mechanisms to reduce the extent to which actually people aren't using the skills that they've developed elsewhere to the right extent, especially some people are interested in the healthcare issue. The other was there are some other questions around is this partly as well because of different forms of discrimination and kind of these different, if you like, non-legal
Yeah.
barriers that migrants and refugees might face. That's kind of one thing around skill shortages. The other is, of course, given that you know, this is an incredibly hot topic in the UK at the moment in terms of how do we think about our migration and refugee policy.
Mm.
The picture, especially at the beginning, that you painted of was one of positive selection in terms of people who want to come. Obviously, it's a little bit different with refugees, but nonetheless,
Mm.
these are often very highly skilled people, and they have a positive impact on firms. What's going on, and so to what
Yeah.
extent is that how do we think about this disjuncture between the economics literature and then the kind of media and political narrative? So you can
Yeah.
both big questions for
Both big
just a couple of
questions.
minutes.
Yeah, let's try. Okay, so the first one. So here, this is sort of the question of, why are immigrants so underpaid relative to their observable characteristics, such as education and experience and so on. And partly, clearly, this is that we just cannot measure or observe all the aspects. So it may just be that, language skills play a big role. It may be that other types of sort of non-education skills that are not as transferable between places may play a role here, not just language, but this could be cultural communication, could be knowing the local legal framework within healthcare, knowing the local procedures, things like that. All of that might take time, and you need this sort of adjustment period. And I'm certainly not saying all of this has to be discrimination. It may certainly be other types of skills that we're not observing here and modeling that are much harder to transfer. And there's lots of papers showing that those are the ones that sort of also tend to change over time and actually, to tend to bring people closer to their sort of earnings potential. That said, there is also a vast literature on discrimination. Like there's these sort of audit studies where you send out CVs who look exactly the same, but randomly you choose a foreign sounding name or a local sounding name, and locals and get up to like 3 times more callbacks and so on for exactly the same CV. And so clearly it's a mix of both. I can't give you an exact figure of which one is it, but probably it's both. I'll leave it at that. I know there's like so much else to say here, but I'll leave it here. The question is, the second one was about the disconnect between positively selected migrants who are actually quite highly skilled, much more highly skilled than the local population on average, at least given the existing immigration systems, and why is the discourse in the media so different? And so, I mean, my take is really that the economics literature has, I think, over many years, and again, there is some debate there, but only at the fringes, shown that immigration overall is beneficial to migrants. It's probably beneficial to destination countries, at least at the levels that we see. We're not going to say, well, whatever we saw is also going to be true when when we have, 100 million people coming to the UK. No, at some point, presumably these findings don't hold, but at least at the levels that we've seen, is probably beneficial to destination countries, certainly to destination firms. Presumably will be even more beneficial now that we have fewer young people in Europe with an aging population. And so the economics here is fairly clear, but my take is that economics isn't everything, right? People are worried about culture, about political changes and institutions, about norms, all of these other things. And there's really cool economics work too. I cited a few in the references that look at to what degree do migrant flows change local culture and institutions, and to what degree do they also transmit local culture and institutions back home in terms of changing aspirations or norms around gender, for example, or other types of things. And that certainly happens, but they're much slower, much more diffuse concepts. They take longer to adjust and also potentially a bit harder and a bit understudied. And so maybe that's where the disconnect comes from. I think the economic case for migration is relatively clear. The cultural one is one that maybe is not at the center of our expertise, and where at least we haven't done enough work on, and we should do much more.
That's great. Thank you for navigating some of those slightly tricky kind of big questions. That was a fantastic presentation. And yeah, again, thank you for the discussion. We will be, the recording of this will be made available on the department's YouTube channel. And I believe that as well, the slides with all the references will be circulated to those who signed up. But again, thank you, Dennis, for a great presentation.
Thanks
and
for the
for all of
great
you for
questions.
joining.
Appreciate it.
And yeah, there'll be another series of What Economists Really Do, which we've already kind of planned for next year. And yeah, so do keep in touch. Okay, thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.